detention centers located in sparse locations controlled by local people defending their homes and villages. That was their connection to documents and detention centers, and they believe it is tantamount to guilt. What they failed to bring out through the over 4 hours of their opening statement is context. War. What war does in the context of command and control and effective command and control. Counsel for the SPO talked about collaborators being an existential threat. The only existential threat in 1998 and 1999 was the Yugoslav army and the police in conjunction with paramilitaries. They failed to mention command and control operated at a local grassroots basis where loyalties flowed directly to the operative zone commanders. They failed to mention the essential ingredient of command and control, which is the commander, the general commander of the KLA, who was replaced during the Rambouillet conference while President Thaci and Mr. Krasniqi and Azam Sula were in Paris. Local commanders changed the general commander of the KLA without any input from President Thaci, from Azam Sula, who was then the general commander, or anybody else in Rambouillet. There is no discussion about who controlled the power, and that was at a local level. Nor did they put in context the war that started again so viciously in the summer of 1998 and went into September of 1998. And what did that do to the command and control structure of the KLA? That devastating offensive by the Yugoslav army and the military police. Well, I take the words from the SPO's own witness. It destroyed our brigade. People left and went to other countries. And it wasn't just in our zone that this happened, but for every zone in Kosovo. In fact, there was no command and control left after the offensive in the summer of 1998. And that destruction of the command and control aspects of the KLA replicated itself again in March, April of 1999. With the ethnic cleansing campaign again by the Serb forces. The KLA during that period of time was totally dismembered to the extent that the KLA had recovered from 1998 was virtually eliminated in 1999. What happens to a command and control under these circumstances? What happens to the alleged vertical command and control that the SPO attempted to put before you? It virtually ceases to exist. Yet throughout all of this, the SPO would have you believe there was a functioning command structure with effective control. I submit to your honors, nothing could be further from the truth. What we would like to do at this point, your honors, is begin to put this matter in context, to put the facts of what was happening on the ground in context by beginning with an initial introduction of our client, President Thaci, taking through with you his role throughout all of these years in 1998 and 1999. What we have done is put a roadmap on page 2 and 3 to allow your honors and respective counsel to follow us through, so your honors can know exactly what subjects we're going to touch upon and the relevance to these proceedings. I mean, who was Hashim Thaci in 1998 and 1999? Young man, 30 years of age, not to be confused with the man that became the prime minister and the president of Kosovo years later. He had been a student activist that came back to Kosovo in March of 1998, right after the Yashari murders, which, of course, the Ashari murders being the kicking off point of this alleged joint criminal enterprise. And there was discussions yesterday about motive. And I believe counsel for the SPO talked about motive and that there was no need to examine motive. We submit to Your Honors motive is a very, very important aspect of this case. Hashim Thaci had no motive to participate in any crimes. As one of the political leaders of the KLA, Hashim Thaci knew that the success of the Kosovo Liberation Movement depended on the support of Western countries, in particular the United States. Yes, you can broadcast. I'm sorry. My apologies, Your Honor. I don't think I told the folks to broadcast this. May I proceed? We can move to the next slide. Very early in these proceedings in 1998, the United States offered assistance to the KLA under certain conditions. No attacks on civilians, no actions outside of the territory of Kosovo, no assistance for Islamic fundamentalists or any extremist groups, and no financing for illegal drug trafficking. The conclusion of the CIA in a report to the U.S. House of Representatives noted the UCK, or the KLA, was not involved in terrorist activities designed as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets. Next slide. In short, Hashim Thaci and the KLA had no motive to violate the U.S. conditions. Hashim Thaci was well aware that Kosovo could not achieve either independence or self-rule without the assistance of the United States or other Western powers. He had every motivation not to engage in the JCE described in the indictment to not jeopardize U.S. support. Now, crimes were committed, but they were not motivated by the JCE described in the indictment. President Thaci does not deny that crimes were committed by some Albanian individuals during and after the conflict. He informed the UN Security Council of such in a public hearing on the 17th of December, 2018. But he rejects, and the facts militate against the SPO's claim that the crimes were committed as a matter of policy of the leadership of the KLA. He also rejects the SPO's claims that crimes were committed in a widespread and systematic manner on a scale alleged by the SPO. Where did this violence come from? Because there was violence, and we do not argue that there was violence. But the violence was the result of uncontrolled, localized activity, not the product of a JCE. There was revenge and score settling, general lawlessness due to the war and the post-war absence of institutions. And we will get into those issues as we move forward. And the lack of effective control by the general staff over operative zones. Because the KLA was a locally based army, to the extent that it was an army at all. And post-war hatred of the displaced population returning after the war ended had a lot to do with the violence that took place. In short, revenge was a significant motive for violence and crime. Crimes committed by the Serbian regime explain the violence that occurred during the war and following the return of the displaced population. At no point during the SPO's opening was the issue of revenge of the local population during the war as to what happened to them by the Serb regime and thereafter ever discussed. If I can quote for you the comments at the time, this is September 22nd of 1999, these are the comments of Milo Đukanović. Comments that are very significant because when he made them, he was not only the president of Montenegro, but as I know your honors know, this was Serbia and Montenegro. They were part of, they were connected with Serbia. It wasn't just Montenegro alone. And he noted in comments to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the ordeal that the Serbs, the Montenegrins, and other Albanians are undergoing is the result of the atrocities perpetrated by Serb forces who wreaked havoc during the war in the province and then fled to safe distances, leaving their compatriots to pay for their misdeeds. Revenge by the population was very much a reason for the crimes that took place on the ground. If we can turn to the next video. This is a video from the BBC, and it talks about the expulsion of civilians from Peja in March and April of 1999.
Nuk ishte mundësi që t'ju kundërvyen aleatëve të NATO-s, ata do të na kundërvyen neve përmes dritarëve që po shkonte ty me flakë shumë të mëshëm, sepse e pritja se edhe neve do të na ndodhë e njëjta gjë me do na dëbojnë nga shtëpia ose do na kallin në shtëpi. Isha shumë i dëshpëruar.
Valmir and his sister Valentina remembered the threats their Serbian neighbors had issued earlier. Now their neighbors turned on them again.
5 minuta pasi ram për të fjetur gjithë, filluan disa trokitje në derë, në gjuhën e tij serbe, dhe me njëherë filloi me këto fjalë policia, qeleni derën.
Pastaj pas zërit që e dëgjoj e kuptoj se është kuishia.
Se të mbyste të gjithë familjen apo për ndonjë përdhunim tjetër.
That night they were herded with thousands of others into a sports stadium.
Aty s'kishte çka për të parë, ishte mund të them ndoshta jo i tash qyteti, por gjysma e qytetit deri për ai të pasur, pasi që kishte të smut, kishte bebe, njerëz pleq, plaka, invalid, por këta ju kthenin me përgjigjen, vetë keni kërkuar kështu, keni kërkuar NATO dhe tash durani.
The next day they were driven on foot from their country, the first trickle of what would soon become a flood of humanity. Valentina thought only of returning and of revenge.
O Zot, a ka mëshirë për neve dhe do të vijë një ditë dhe t'ju kthejmë dhe na këtyre kështu sikur na përqeshin.
Revenge. The motivation for so much of the violence that took place during and certainly after the war. And the Limai judgment acknowledged that and noted that revenge was a significant motive for crime. In Limai, they expressly found that rogue elements of the KLA had in fact committed crimes against perceived collaborators with the Serbian regime in revenge for crimes that had been committed against Albanians. A number of Kosovo Albanian citizens may have been abducted for other reasons, such as personal revenge of individual KLA members and other motives. The KLA did not have the resources or the command structure to adequately control the implementation of this policy by its forces, and at the time relevant to the indictment, the Chamber accepts that individual cases of abduction for reasons not within the collaborator policy were carried out by rogue elements of the KLA. Now, Your Honors, we have, of course, taken your guidance on not going through all the Serbian crimes. We are not advancing a tu quoque defense, but I believe a brief recitation of the idea of the crimes that took place during the operative time frame, and this list is not meant to be exhaustive, but an examination of some of these incidents during this time frame, I believe, would be instructive. This is during February, March 1998, and thereafter, we have the 5 March 1999 Yashari compound killings, 59 dead, 18 women, 10 children. 23 April 1998, Takan, 20 Albanians dead. In the 6 months, in spring, summer 1998, 300 villages were ravaged with over 250,000 people driven from their homes. These attacks were accompanied by military operations against the KLA by the Yugoslav Army and the Serbian police from the spring 1998, increasing intensity until October 1998. That is the offensive for which I referred to from the SPO witness that their brigades were totally destroyed in the KLA, and they were destroyed all over Kosovo. 26 September 1998, Abria Ebreme, 25 killed. 15 January 1999, Ratchak, 45, excuse me. 27 March 1999, Krushamada, 241 killed. 28 March 1999, Izbica, somewhere between 146 and 166 Albanians were killed. Rosalia, 41 Albanians killed. And 5 April 1999, 27 April 1999, in Maya, 300 Albanians, 2 May 1999, in Studeme, 100 Albanians killed. And then, of course, the forced expulsion from Kosovo itself of 800,000 Albanians, with another approximately 250 to 300,000 Kosovo Albanians being displaced from their homes during the operative time frame in the winter offensive of 1999. What does this do to the command structure of the KLA? The Serbian violence led to the destruction of the KLA and led to action from the UN Security Council. The brutality and scope of the Serb state acts during the summer of 1998 offensive nearly destroyed the KLA. Soldiers left their units, they left the country, and when a ceasefire came, they attempted to piece the entire entity back together again. What came about as a result of this violence was U.S. Security Council Resolution 1199, which expressed grave concern over the excessive and indiscriminate use of force by Serb forces, demanding that the parties cease hostilities and that the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia order the withdrawal of security units used for civilian repression.
The interpreters kindly note that this is really too fast for a proper interpretation of your opening statement. We will burn out.
I take direction, Your Honor, and unfortunately I have been accused of that before. And I do apologize to the folks in the interpretation booth, and I will slow down. Compliance with the Resolution 1199 rested with the Kosovo Verification Committee created in 1998. However, yet another massacre in Ratchak in 1999 threatened the KVM mission and led to another onset of hostilities by the Serb forces. We will turn to the video in Ratchak where 45 were killed.
Homes in the village of Ratchak were still smoldering on Saturday, a day after Serb forces launched an attack on separatist Kosovo Liberation Army fighters. At first it appeared that a number of civilians had been caught in the crossfire. But international observers, led by the American William Walker, now say as many as 45 civilians were executed by Serb forces. Surviving villagers say the Serb police separated men from their families on Friday before herding them up a hill where they were shot. All the dead were wearing civilian clothing, among them a young woman, a 12-year-old boy, and many older men, including one aged 70.
Unfortunately, I do not have the words to describe my personal revulsion or that of all who were with me at the sight of what can only be described as an unspeakable atrocity.
These atrocities were followed by other acts, criminal acts by the Serb forces. But it did lead, we can go to the next slide, in an emergency meeting, if I will, of the contact group ministers, which was convened in London on 29 January 1999. The contact group condemned the Ratchak massacre and summoned the parties to Rambouillet to, quote, stop the spiral of violence that is building towards renewed humanitarian catastrophe and all-out war. Not only was it leading to humanitarian catastrophe and all-out war, it led to the destruction of any conceivable command structure within the KLA. NATO expressed its readiness to take whatever measures necessary if the parties fail to meet the demands of the international community. And so we move to the Rambouillet Conference in February of 1999. Mr. Thaci had been elected leader of the Albanian delegation, but the fact is that Mr. Thaci, who was living in Switzerland at the time, had no control over the KLA. Hashim Thaci could not sign the Rambouillet Agreement without the consent of the zone commanders, and the zone commanders had so much power that they sacked the general commander, Azim Sula, while Hashim Thaci was in Rambouillet. And if I might add, we can go, not only was Hashim Thaci in Rambouillet, so was Azim Sula. So, to lay the scene, Hashim Thaci is in Rambouillet, as is Azim Sula, as in other members of the KLA, including Mr. Krasniqi. At the time, Azim Sula is the general commander of the KLA. And with no input from Hashim Thaci or Azim Sula or anybody part of the KLA delegation, Azim Sula was sacked as commander and replaced by Suleyman Selimi. Now this is supposed to be a command structure that has effective command and control over all of the detention centers that were outlined by the SPO yesterday. By this act alone, the court unmistakably can conclude that there was no effective command and control structure by Mr. Thaci or anybody else in Rambouillet over the zone commanders in the field. He simply did not have effective control over the KLA, nor the final authority over the politics and policy of the KLA. The evidence from Rambouillet demonstrates that Hashim Thaci did not have the ability to prevent or punish crimes occurring in the zones. And as I noted, although Hashim Thaci was elected leader of the Albanian delegation, the real power remained with the zone commanders. Next slide. I have set forth here, Your Honors, the delegations. There were LDK members, Mr. Rogover, Prime Minister Bukoshi. There were LBD members, and of course there were KLA members and also independents. I highlighted Azim Sula's name there because at that time he was the general commander of the KLA when he got to Rambouillet. Unfortunately, he was not the general commander of the KLA when he left Rambouillet. And that was a decision that was made by none of these KLA representatives in Rambouillet. The vehement opposition to this delegation's attendance and engagement from some KLA factions, including the zone commanders and the Albanian diaspora. As I noted, in the midst of the Rambouillet negotiations, the Azim Sula was removed from his position and replaced by Suleyman Selimi as overall KLA commanders, and these developments were supported publicly by Adem Demaci. Now we will talk about Adem Demaci and the power that Adem Demaci wielded in the KLA, but I note for the record that after almost 4 hours of discussion yesterday, the name Adem Demaci did not come from the SPO in any context as wielding any power in the KLA. Suffice it to say, this decision on the removal of Azim Sula was made with no consultation with Azim Sula, Hashim Thaci, or anybody else. Yet, we sit yesterday for over 4 hours through a litany of detention centers and command and control arguments and documents without once referencing the fact that the person, the overall commander of the KLA, was removed without any input by the so-called folks who were in Rambouillet and speaking on behalf of the KLA. Who was in command and control of any of these detention centers? I think it's quite clear. It was the people on the local level, the zone commanders and their subordinates. And as far as Hashim Thaci's ability to sign any Rambouillet agreement whatsoever, that was seriously called into question by a variety of factors. The first factor was the need for some type, or the desire for some type of approval by Adam Damaci. Adam Damaci was the KLA general political representative and supreme political authority in the KLA. During the conference in Rambouillet, Hashim Thaci left Rambouillet to travel to Slovenia to seek Damaci's approval and support. U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright called Damaci to support Rambouillet. He categorically denied. Damaci opposed participating and signing the Rambouillet agreement because it did not include independence for Kosovo. Notwithstanding that, Mr. Thaci went back to Rambouillet to discuss matters with international leaders, who then in turn put pressure on him to sign the Rambouillet Accords, which he ultimately did not. We can turn to the next tape.
The foreign ministers all sat at a long table, as if we were in judgment or something. And first Thaci was brought in with a couple of other members of the Albanian delegation. The question was basically, do you agree with the framework, yes or no? And we were expecting a yes, or I was. I said, look, I don't understand what just happened in there. You have let us down. It is an impossible situation now. How could you do this? We expected you to be a leader.
Albright ka deklaruar se po që se ju nënshkruani, serbët nuk nënshkruajnë, ne do të bombardojmë. Ne do të aktivizohemi. Po që se çfarë është? Serbët e pranojnë, ne kemi duart e lidhura.
You could see that he was just shocked. I mean, he looked like a high school student that I had dressed down.
He looked like a high school student that I had dressed down. This person that the SPO wants to advance as spearheading the efforts of the KLA are described by the Secretary of State as a high school student that she had just dressed down. And there was a reason why he did not want to sign the Rambouillet Accords. Keeping in mind, Your Honors, that if they didn't sign the Rambouillet Accords, NATO would not intervene. If they did sign, they would, and then they would begin their bombing campaign. The stakes were quite high. Yet Hashim Thaci was reluctant to sign the accords, and we will tell you the reason why. We can go to the next tape.
Mrs. Albright was confident Thaci would accept the terms on offer, even though they promised Kosovo only autonomy within Serbia, not the independence the KLA was fighting for. But she didn't realize the pressure the KLA leader was under from home.
We phoned each delegate and warned them. We said, don't dare sign. In Kosovo, there was the opinion that maybe the Albanian delegation is acting in a treason. I remember one of them, I told them, we have anti-aircraft rockets on the Serbs. We'll use them against Serbs. If you sign, we'll say, want to bring down your plane.
An operative zone commander, Namdegur Remy, noted that they signed the Rambouillet Accords, they will take down the plane with a rocket. And these threats did not just come from the zone commanders, and they were not just some imagined threat that Hashim Thaci came up with in Rambouillet. They're reflected in the book of Ambassador Christopher Hill, who is a senior U.S. ambassador in these delegations throughout the Rambouillet Accords in February of 1999. He wrote a book, An Outpost, where he talks about his conversations with Hashim Thaci on this particular issue. If we can go to that slide. Hill asks, "Why can't you agree to this?" I asked Thaci, truly not understanding whether he comprehended the near fatal consequences for the Kosovars of a no answer. "It is you who don't understand," he replied. "If I agree to this, I will go home and they will kill me." Those threats were echoed by yet another zone commander and then the general commander of the KLA, Suleiman Salimi. He noted in a book, Kosovo War and Peace, "The first time, as I said, we managed through some kind of threat to stop the signing of the Rambouillet Agreement. We threatened them that if they signed something without us knowing, meaning all commanders of the zones, people who carried the burdens of the war, then they would have consequences." Notwithstanding any argument or opening that you heard yesterday, Your Honors, Hashim Thaci did not control the KLA. The zone commanders did. This is a reference to comments by then Senator Biden before the Committee of Foreign Relations of the U.S. Senate. He had had a meeting in July of 1999 with Hashim Thaci, and he made these comments before Foreign Relations on 26 September 1998. And in this, you can see Thaci was trying to advance the position of the KLA in bringing about the end of the war. He notes, "It seems to me bombing worked, and even though Mr. Thaci tells me, as I met with him for several hours, how he did anything, that is," and pardon my comment here, "a bunch of crap." And I'm not sure that's a comment that's bandied about the Committee of Foreign Relations often. "The incremental impact of the KLA on this process was just that, incremental. No evidence, none." Not surprising, because the KLA had been virtually destroyed during this period of time. "You may be talking about 1,500 fighters, not 10,000. Mr. Thaci asked me, he said, "You are 29, like I am, when you took office. Do you have any advice?" I said, "Well, if you're asking, I am happy to tell you, although very different circumstances." He said, "What is your advice?" I said, "Number one, do not take yourself so seriously. And number two, understand, I know that you know you do not control the KLA." Next slide, please. Despite intense pressure, Hashim Thaci would not sign without the approval of zone commanders. Keep in mind, Your Honor, there were two key concessions from the United States that the Kosovo delegation secured. First, within 3 years, the will of the people would be taken into account in a referendum. That assurance was conveyed in a draft letter from the U.S. delegation. Second, the KLA would undertake a transformation process, meaning it would have to transform from an army into a civil force. To continue the pressure on Mr. Thaci to sign, U.S. Secretary of State Albright arranged for a meeting with the Albanian delegation and NATO General Wesley Clark, who at that time was the Supreme Allied Commander for NATO. Despite these concessions and pressure from the international community and the Albanian delegation, because there were others in the Albanian delegation that wanted to sign, Thaci refused to give his final approval until he obtained the consent of the zone commanders. Next slide, please. Kosovo Albanian delegation then returned to Kosovo after the Rambouillet conference to seek approval from the zone commanders and other segments of society. They met with zone commanders and other KLA units to explain the agreement and seek their approval. Several zone commanders were not convinced, but ultimately did not oppose the signing of the Rambouillet conference because they feared loss of support from the international community, including NATO, and the civilian population was suffering. This was at a time when the KLA was under siege and virtually decimated, and it only got worse. Moreover, they were persuaded by U.S. Secretary of State Albright's letter promising an independent referendum in 3 years, and that the KLA would not be disbanded, but transformed. Ultimately, when they went back to Paris in March of 1999, the 18th of March, and the agreement was signed. Now, if we can turn our attention to the Provisional Government of Kosovo, because comments were made yesterday by the SPO that the Provisional Government of Kosovo came in to fill a vacuum of power, and that the Provisional Government of Kosovo, with Mr. Thaci as the named Prime Minister, was attempting to take control of Kosovo. Nothing is further from the truth, both factually and legally. And let us go back and talk about this power vacuum that the SPO talks about. When did the Provisional Government of Kosovo, or the idea, if you will, of the Provisional Government of Kosovo come up? At the Rambouillet Accords. During the Rambouillet negotiations, U.S. Secretary of State Albright and other European leaders urged that a unified structure be established to speak on behalf of all Kosovo Albanians and to be an implementing partner for the Rambouillet Agreement with OSCE, KVM, and NATO. Keep in mind, Your Honors, at this juncture, there was no discussion of UNMIC. UNMIC had not been created, and in February of 1999, it wasn't even contemplated. The Rambouillet Accords were intended to be an inclusive structure. The Provisional Government of Kosovo was intended to be an inclusive structure, not just comprised of KLA members, but also members of the LDK and the LBD. We have before you the agreement that is in, obviously, Albanian, and the translation in the next slide that is signed by Hashim Thaci for the KLA, Dr. Ibrahim Rugova for the LDK, and for the LBD, Recep Koja. And this was supposed to be a temporary government that was going to be in place until free elections were held, and that the three political groups would have equal representation. So the Provisional Government of Kosovo was not some plan by Hashim Thaci or anybody else in the Kosovo Albanian side to fill some power vacuum to take over the country. To the contrary, even after the Serbs refused to sign the Rambouillet Accords and the LDK pulled out of the the Provisional Government of Kosovo, the United States still wanted a provisional government set up so that the provisional government could work in concert with international entities on the ground. I cite to you a cable by Secretary of State Albright on the 12th of April, 1999. Secretary Albright stressed the need for a broad-based Kosovo provisional government. It was good places had been reserved for the LDK, and it was important to continue to reach out to Rugova. While we could not recognize the provisional government, we would certainly want to work with it in practice. So what is the takeaway from all of this information about the Provisional Government of Kosovo. The Provisional Government of Kosovo was an inclusive implementing partner with the international community. It was intended to be a broad-based government incorporating all Kosovo Albanian political entities. It was not designed to enable the KLA to forcefully take control of Kosovo by targeting opponents and marginalizing other political parties. And it was not designed to fill some quote-unquote power vacuum that has been advanced by the SPO. To the contrary, at the urging of the U.S. and internationals, it was the basic framework upon which international entities would rebuild the civil infrastructure of Kosovo in concert with the international community. Its work began before the war ended, but it began in earnest to work with international entities after the war. With the withdrawal of the Serbian forces and the establishment of UNMIK, and we will get to the UNMIK establishment in a moment, the Provisional Government of Kosovo sought to facilitate the return of refugees and assist in civilian support to municipalities in the country, which would include distribution of food, locating places to live, education, utilities, and other civil functions. The Provisional Government of Kosovo did not have any control over military structures. That was under the authority of KFOR Commander Sir General Mike Jackson and the KLA Commander General Ajim Cheku. And in the post-war arena, the Provisional Government of Kosovo was only one of several governments competing for popular support, including the Rugova Bukoshi Provisional Government and a Serbian office. But let us turn, if we can, for a moment to the 1999 Serb ethnic cleansing campaign and what that did to the command and control structure of the KLA. What that did to the command and control structure of the KLA and all of the matters, or many of the matters that were discussed by the SPO yesterday, where this impact was never addressed. Make no mistake that the plan of the Serb authorities was to ethnically cleanse Kosovo of Kosovo Albanians. We can go to the next tape.
Serbia's parliament duly backed Milosevic's rejection of the Rambouillet terms, as did the Serb public. Serbia's deputy prime minister revealed what Milosevic was planning to do next.
Ako dođe do bombardovanja od strane mi Srbi ćemo prilično stradati, ali Albanaca na
terms, as did the Serb public. Serbia's deputy prime minister
Zamjenik premijera Srbije otkrio je što Milošević sljedeće namjerava da uradi.
stradati, ali Albanaca na Kosovu neće biti.
The bombing campaign goes forward. We will suffer casualties, but there will be no Kosovo Albanians left. The bombing campaign went from 24 March of 1999 to 9 June. True to the word of Mr. Sheshel, the ethnic cleansing continued during that bombing period. As we noted previously, 800,000 Kosovo Albanians were expelled to other countries, and another 500,000 internally displaced. Homes were burned, IDs seized, farm animals killed, water sources contaminated, women raped. The goal of the Serb campaign was to prevent the Kosovo Albanian population from ever returning to their homes and villages in Kosovo. And the deportation of these individuals was on a massive scale. We turn to the next tape.
On the ground, the chaos that was sweeping the countryside was about to hit the capital. Unhindered by NATO airstrikes, armed police and paramilitaries began to spread terror among the civilian population, looting as they went.
Prema tome nije bilo nikakvih šansi da na prostoru Kosme.
There was no chance that anyone would attack the army from the back in Kosovo. As soon as NATO started attacking civilian targets, there was a mass population movement out of Kosovo. This favored our defensive deployments.
Vehicles patrolled the streets as systematically the civilian population were given a few hours to leave. These pictures were taken secretly by a concealed Albanian photographer.
Mi smo naravno pokušavali da ih odvratimo te ideje.
We tried to dissuade them, and sometimes we succeeded. A great number stayed in Kosovo and were protected by our units.
That was a lie. General Pavkovic's units were in fact organizing the biggest program of forced deportation in Europe since the Second World War. It was bound by the sheer force of the image to evoke memories of Nazi Germany.
We knew that there would have been some effort to retaliate against the population, but what we didn't foresee is that it would be calculated in a way that would have generated a massive refugee outflow.
The scale of it was breathtaking. Milosevic had dramatically raised the stakes.
This entire ethnic cleansing campaign was part of the Milosevic judgment. If we can go to the next slide, where the court as read by Judge Bonamy, as part of the summary in Milosevic, noted that the most compelling evidence in support of the allegations that there was a common purpose to modify the ethnic balance in Kosovo in order to ensure continued control by the FRY and Serbian authorities over the province is the evidence establishing a widespread campaign of violence that was directed against Kosovo Albanian population between March and June 1999, and resulting massive displacement of that population. What was the effect on the KLA and the command and control structure of the KLA? In short, the fighting capability of the KLA was crippled as a result of Serbia's ethnic cleansing campaign. Supplies to the KLA were cut off, and of course the morale of KLA members plummeted. Most of the KLA members inside Kosovo left their units for good reason, to accompany their families who had been expelled from their homes and villages. If I might emphasize, Your Honors, that this was a volunteer army of volunteer fighters where people could come and go virtually as they pleased. The Serb offensive destroyed individual KLA units and shattered the KLA's command structure, such that most of the general staff of the KLA left Kosovo. During this entire period of time, virtually the entire general staff was not even in Kosovo. The Serb offensive, the second Serb offensive, not the one in 1998, we're now talking about the massive campaign in 1999, removed any possibility for the KLA to operate as a cohesive unit. That was the impact on the command and control structures of the KLA while these events were transpiring, and while you heard so much evidence by the SPO of events taking place on the ground. There was no KLA command structure, and certainly no effective command structure. We can just change topics for one moment. We talk a bit about the end of the armed conflict. Next slide, please. After 78 days of bombing, NATO prepared for a ground war, and Milosevic elected to end hostilities in Kosovo. On 3 June 1999, the Serb parliament confirmed the decision to end the armed conflict. On 9 June, Serbia signed the Kumanovo Agreement with KFOR, which provided that all Serb forces would leave Kosovo no later than 20 June 1999. What came into effect the next day was UN Security Council Resolution 1244. The United Nations took over responsibility for maintaining law and order. Their responsibility, as part of a Chapter 7 resolution, was maintaining law and order, including establishing local police forces, and meanwhile, through the deployment of international police personnel in Kosovo, protecting and promoting human rights, ensuring the safe and unimpeded return of all refugees and displaced persons to their homes in Kosovo. With the end of the war, KFOR arrived in Kosovo on 12 June 1998, followed by unmixed civilian personnel the next day, the 13th. On schedule, 20 June 1999, Serb forces withdrew from Kosovo pursuant to the Kumanovo Agreement. On the 21st of June, KLA and KFOR signed the undertaking to begin the demilitarization of the KLA. Such undertakings were signed with KFOR with other armed groups such as FARC. FARC was the armed wing of the LDK. At the urging of the U.S., Hashim Thaci signed the undertaking, and after the signing of the undertaking, President Clinton congratulated him for doing so. On 24 June 1999, Serbian parliament lifted the state of war. At that juncture, notwithstanding the protestations and allegations of the SPO, the war was over. It did not extend until September 1999. And what happened with UNMIK when they took over pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 1244? This was the first time the UN had established an international civil and security presence as was mandated in 1244. The goal to assume full control over judicial, legal, security, and administrative functions. This was not a typical peacekeeping mission. It was unprecedented undertaking in terms of magnitude and complexity. UNMIK was mandated to establish the rule of law and restore Kosovo's institution of self-government. Was it easy? No. To the contrary, it is quite difficult, as reflected by the comments by General Clark to the U.S. Armed Services Committee on 2 February of 2000. The difference between Bosnia and Kosovo is that we are dealing with organized governmental factions in Bosnia. There were police, there were elected officials, there were structures that one could deal with. That hasn't been the mission in Kosovo. There are no governmental structures. There are no local police. There's no shadow communist network, party network, which had kept everybody intimidated there and performed as a shadow government. Instead, there are 1.6 million people who are looking to the United Nations for their total civilian leadership and to KFOR for stability, authority, order, and protection, while civilian structures are created. When UNMIK arrived on the 13th of June, Kosovo was devoid of civil and security institutions. There were no laws, no courts, no municipal structures, no civil society, no municipal services. And what happens in such an environment? In this lawless environment, hundreds of thousands of displaced Kosovo Albanians return to find their homes destroyed, their property taken, and their loved ones missing or dead, and no civil institutions. In short, looking for revenge. Localized individual acts of violence fueled by anger, hatred, and score settling were inevitable, and often caused by criminals, rogue elements of the KLA, and people posing as KLA in uniforms purchased on the streets of Pristina and elsewhere. As the International Crisis Group reported in 6th of August, 1999, the KLA denied that there was an organized campaign aimed at creating an ethnically pure Kosovo Albanians. And that was credible because of the revenge motive, and that there was not sufficient proof of an organized campaign. And the Pentagon was well aware of that. This is Ken Bacon speaking on 5 June 1999, shortly before the bombing campaign ended, who commented on what they anticipated was going to happen at the end of the bombing campaign. We can turn to that.
The fact of the matter is that I don't think that Kosovo is going to be a very happy place for Serbs when NATO comes in, and I don't think Serbs will want to stay there. I think they'll want to return to Serbia. We don't know how big the Serb minority is there. It's probably about 100,000, could be a little more than that. But as Kosovo Albanians flow back in, our assumption is that many Serbs will probably return to Serbia.
It sounds like you're encouraging the Serbs who now live in Kosovo then to leave.
I'm not encouraging them at all. I'm just stating what we anticipate the facts will be.
And General Clark echoed those comments and also talked with a reporter about what the KLA was actually trying to do. And if we can turn to the next tape, this is a tape from 1st of July, 1999.
Margaret Warner has our interview with U.S. Army General Wesley Clark, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. She spoke to him earlier this evening.
Welcome, General.
Thank you, Margaret.
I want to talk to you first about the KFOR mission in Kosovo. Secretary of State Albright said yesterday when she was up at the UN, the people of Kosovo are not safe. Is that true?
Well, I think that this is a period of sorting out that's going on. There are hundreds of thousands of people coming back. There have been some terrible things done in that country. There are all kinds of emotions running rampant. And there are Serbs still there, some of whom may have participated in that, others who are just afraid they're going to be taken for guilty because of their ethnicity. There are gypsies who are also being discriminated against. And so there's some legitimate efforts to get property back, there's some revenge taking, there's some score settling. One doesn't really know, but it's a very difficult time. Our troops are there, we're doing everything we can, but of course we're not police.
Do you think if Serbs continue to leave and they don't come back, do you think that in any way undercuts the credibility of what NATO went to war for, this multi-ethnic ideal, as you put it?
Well, I think we have to temper the ideal with reality. And we don't know how widespread Serb popular participation in the atrocities really were. And so maybe a lot of these people helped themselves to their neighbor's property, participated in some masked banditry and worse mischief while the ethnic cleansing was going on. We just don't know. And so some of the people that are leaving may well consider themselves as real targets for international justice as well as for Albanian revenge. So it's a little hard to generalize. But as I said, the ideal is we'd like to promote a multi-ethnic society. And by the way, the KLA leadership has called for the same thing.
And do you think they're genuine?
I think they are.
And the person and the voice at that point calling for a multi-ethnic country in Kosovo was Hashim Thaci. During Mr. Misicic's presentation, your honors will get to see, during this very volatile time frame, the steps that Hashim Thaci was making and speeches he was making to his own people and the international community to bring back and bring about that peaceful reconciliation. Hardly the person who came in to fill a power void, to promote violence so that he and anybody else in the provisional government of Kosovo could take over. To the contrary, and if we just can touch on a few other items, was that Hashim Thaci supported practical efforts in this post-war arena to control violence and promote ethnic tolerance. When UNMIK first came to Kosovo, following the 13th of June, 1999, the Authority for Public Security in Kosovo arrested solely with UNMIK, not with anybody else, just with UNMIK, pursuant to 1244. Despite having the legal authority, UNMIK could not prevent the violence because it didn't initially have the resources. KFOR had the resources but did not have the training or the desire to undertake police functions. What is clear is that the KLA, next slide please, lacked policing authority. Neither the KLA nor any Kosovo Albanian organization had authority to act as security forces. UNMIK's civil security presence did not step aside and cede government control to any person or entity. One need only look at UNMIK Regulation 1.1. All legislative and executive authority with respect to Kosovo, including the administration of justice, is vested in UNMIK. They had no power to, KLA and the Provisional Government of Kosovo had no power to arrest, had no power to prosecute, had no power to incarcerate. All of that power, that legal power, rested with UNMIK. Notwithstanding that, and knowing that there were problems on the streets of Pristina and the other areas of Kosovo, Hashim Thaci promoted, in the next slide, and supported the Kosovo police force. Now, before we go into this, the argument by the SPO in their pretrial brief and in their indictment is that through this power vacuum that the Provisional Government of Kosovo and Hashim Thaci was somehow boiling up and promoting this violence so that they would be the ones that could fill this power vacuum. One should ask, if you want to promote this type of violence, if you want to promote this type of upheaval, why would you support a police force? Why would you support the demilitarization of the KLA? Why wouldn't you just send the KLA to the mountains of Kosovo where they could live and fight another day? He didn't do that. He didn't do that. Look what he did for the Kosovo police force. In early July 1999, it was very clear, and UNMIK recognized the lack of police enforcement presence in the streets of Kosovo. UNMIK and the OSCE, with the full support of Hashim Thaci, created the Kosovo Police Service, which was designed to train Kosovos of all ethnicities. And keep in mind that Hashim Thaci promoted a police force, a multi-ethnic police force, to serve as police officers and begin handling criminal activity and violence. Training program was accelerated with the recognition that this was an urgent need, and the first class graduated in October of '99. In supporting the police force, Hashim Thaci addressed two civil unrest issues: to get police officers on the street to deal with violence, and to get individual former KLA soldiers employed in reducing the violence. In addition, he worked with KFOR and UNMIK for the demilitarization of the KLA. Is this a step of someone that is bent on taking power and doing so through civil unrest? I suggest to your honors, it is not. As part of the demilitarization process, which had begun on the 20th of June, 1999, the KLA was transformed into the Kosovo Protection Corps, a civil entity. The KLA Zone Commander's reluctance to demilitarize and was transformed by the personal intervention of General Clark with the commanders. General Clark, in fact, came and convinced them personally to sign on to this agreement. The demilitarization process proceeded to a successful conclusion under the authority of KFOR General Sir Mike General Jackson and the KLA commander Hashim Thaci in coordination with UNMIK and with the support of Hashim Thaci. And the picture we have before you, of course, is Hashim Thaci to the left, Bernard Kouchner from the UN and UNMIK, that's Sir Mike Jackson in the middle, that's Hashim Thaci, and of course, General Wesley Clark, signed on September the 21st of 1999. And how did this go? Was this just something that was in writing? Was this just something that wasn't taking place in reality on the stand? General Clark answered that before the U.S. Armed Services Committee on 2 February 2000. Senator Reid asks General Clark, let me ask you with respect to the KLA, are they abiding by their agreement to disarm to your satisfaction? General Clark, yes, they are. Senator Reid, and also in terms of their integration into the new civil service, for want of a better term, of Kosovo, that integration is going peacefully and effectively? General Clark, it is. So here, this man who's supposed to lead this provisional government in violence and unrest to fill this power vacuum is participating and assisting in establishing 2 crucial institutions to disarm the KLA and to promote civil order on the streets with the establishment of the Kosovo police force. Now let us talk a bit just about the structure of the KLA, because we didn't hear anything about the structure of the KLA except in some documents that the SPO put on the screen yesterday without explaining what actually happened on the ground with the KLA. But let's talk about the KLA beginning in 1998. The KLA was a fledgling guerrilla force made up of local groups of volunteers set to defend their homes. This was not an army. This was people who, to try to repel and throw off the yoke of the Serbian regime, got together as volunteers to protect their villages and homes. Who were these people? These volunteers were farmers, teachers, workers, students, and other civilians from cities, towns, and villages throughout Kosovo and the diaspora. They weren't trained soldiers. They weren't trained military people. They weren't people that had spent time in armies. They were the common man. As a result, units came together at a local level with loyalty to local leaders. And as I noted previously, any developing attempts to organize, those were destroyed in the spring of 1998 by the vastly superior Serbian forces during their summer offensive, which, as I noted, one of the SPO witnesses will tell you that the brigades were destroyed, and those brigades were destroyed all over Kosovo. In November of 1998, as part of the attempted reorganization from the summer offensive that decimated the KLA reconfirmed Hashim Sula as the general commander, not Hashim Thaci, reconfirmed Hashim Sula, the individual who was replaced in the Rambouillet conference by the zone commanders. In addition, 2 deputy commanders were appointed, neither of whom was Hashim Thaci. Hashim Thaci was named one of the 9 directorates, the political director, or the head of one of the 9 directorates, with no command responsibility over KLA troops in the field. In fact, from approximately 16 November 1998, Hashim Thaci left Kosovo for Western Europe and didn't return to Kosovo until 9 March 1999. So with all of this reorganization and all of this restructuring, what is the end result of the KLA? In light of everything that happened with the summer offensive and the offensive that took place in 1999, which decimated the population, and with the ethnic cleansing calls over 800,000 people to be thrown out of the country. Well, the International Crisis Group had a comment in a 3 March 2000 document noted what happened to the KLA. the highlight, the KLA now is not rigidly structured and never was. And at the bottom, moreover, in terms of a recognizable command structure, the KLA does not exist, and therefore the KLA cannot be blamed for anything. The question has to be, which part of it, which group, which individual? This basic information was reflected in a U.S. Department of State cable on 10 March of 1999, and it talks about the competition or vying for power between the zone commanders and the general staff. It notes, this is March of 1999, after the supposed restructuring, the prospect of the loss of power and influence is the driving force in the opposition to Rambouillet among some military commanders. General Staff political wing officers appear very concerned to maintain KLA unity in the face of the military commander's opposition to Rambouillet. The other major issue has been what the KLA calls its reorganization, but what in fact has been the leadership effort to create an effective general staff with genuine control over the disparate KLA formations scattered about Kosovo. This effort appears to have been only partially successful, as the zone commanders clearly retain considerable operational independence. I'll read that again. The zone commanders clearly retain considerable operation independence. This is of March of 1999. That entire matter is reflected once again in a letter from the New York State Department that was written to the U.S. State Department concerning the KLA command and control. It's from the State Department Assistant Secretary of Legislative Affairs to Mitch McConnell, then the Foreign Operations Committee. The letter is dated 4 May, 1999. 4 May. Just a month before the bombing campaign ends. And in this 4 May 1999 letter, the U.S. State Department tells the United States Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell, moreover, as there is no political structure in Kosovo or effective command and control of the KLA, it would take many months, if not years, to organize them to use and maintain any military assistance the United States would provide. Again, there is no effective command and control of the KLA as of May 1999. What you will find, Your Honors, throughout all of this case and with all of this testimony, the accuracy of the lack of effective command and control in the KLA is beyond any question. There was no effective command and control in the KLA. To the extent there was any attempt to do so, that was destroyed in the first offensive in 1998 and certainly during the ethnic cleansing campaign in 1999. So what was Hashim Thaci's role in the political directorate? We saw this organogram, which we will take on, which was, I will submit to Your Honors, completely wrong, the one submitted yesterday. Let us talk a bit about his role in the political directorate. And let us go back, if you will, to Hashim Thaci coming back to Kosovo in March of 1998 after the Yashari massacre. By spring 1998, he was invited to become a member of the newly named General Staff in charge of logistics and media. What did he do? Transported materials and weapons from Albania, like many KLA soldiers did, and many KLA members did. Engaged with media, specifically facilitating interviews for other KLA leaders, and he himself interfaced with diplomats in the field. But how about his command and control responsibilities, especially over the zone commanders? His lack of command responsibility was demonstrated by the Drenica Subzone Command, who issued an arrest warrant for him on 10 July 1998. So he is supposed to be this big power in the KLA and a subzone commander. This is before they was split up into operative zones. The subzone commander issued an arrest warrant for him on 10 July of 1998. His lack of command responsibility in the field is further demonstrated by the decision to unify the KLA and FARC, an agreement that was not signed, but it was, in fact, a proposal that was made. And if we can turn to the next slide. And this is a SPO document, which unfortunately wasn't played for you yesterday. But this is an agreement by members of FARC and the KLA to join forces. So we heard a tremendous amount yesterday about the KLA fighting the LDK and that the LDK were part of the quote-unquote opponents that the KLA was trying to go after. Well, FARC is the military arm of the LDK. They are attempting to join the military arm of the LDK, this part of these supposed opponents, with the KLA. Importantly, if we look at the individuals that were, first of all, if we look at the individuals that are at the meeting, and this is 2 November 1998, Mr. Thaci is so important, he's not even at the meeting. And look who has to approve this meeting. Adam Damaci, Buhar Bakoshi, the Prime Minister of the LDK, representatives of the KLA, and another representative of the LDK. They do not even mention, he was not perceived, Hashim Thaci was not perceived to be a necessary decision maker. He was not perceived to be a person they had to name in order to bring about this unification of the KLA. And why is that? Quite clearly, in a command and control responsibility for combat operations in the field, Hashim Thaci had no responsibility whatsoever. We turn to the next page. He's listed as Hashim Thaci is listed as one of the members of the government in J1. But look, the power is distributed among FARC members that you see highlighted in yellow. But nevertheless, the import here is who is the person in the KLA who has to approve this? Who is the first person on the list? Can we go back to the other slide? Adam Damaci. Not Hashim Thaci, no one else, Adam Damaci. He was the one who had to agree that the FARC and the KLA unify their forces. And who is this man? We mentioned him previously. He is the general political representative of the KLA from 13 August of 1998 to 2 March of 1999. He's the general political representative, the highest political office of the KLA. During the operative time frame of so much of what the SPO was talking about yesterday, and he's never mentioned in the conversation as the eminent power broker in the KLA, not once. Who was he? And what did he do? He headquartered in Pristina. He had advisors. He held press conferences every week to present the KLA political positions and objectives. He had regular contact with zone commanders, met regularly with representatives of the international community, issued passes to international diplomats and journalists to go to KLA-controlled areas, and mediated the release of KLA detainees. He staunchly opposed the KLA's presence and participation in Rambouillet. A highly respected leader, a person that was the highest political office of the KLA, a person that was revered in Kosovo for having spent so many years in a Serb jail, the person who was presenting KLA's political positions and objectives, and the person that is called upon to approve this agreement for the KLA. and the SPO mentions nothing about him. Nothing about his authority, and then nothing about what steps he took during this operative time frame. Now, if I may, Your Honors, with all due respect, we are moving into the next segment, and if I could turn the floor over to my learned colleague, Mr. Misicic, with the Court's permission.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Mr. President, members of the trial panel, good morning. I will pick up here with a discussion of the importance of the distinction between the words policy and politics in this case. Slide 77, please. The role of the political directorate of the General Staff of the KLA was to present the political objectives of the KLA and communicate the political positions of the KLA with domestic and foreign delegations, as well as with local and international media. Amongst other things, the KLA Political Directorate opened KLA liaison offices in Western countries and held press conferences abroad. The Political Directorate was responsible for liaising with European and American authorities and other organizations like KDOM and OSCE. Importantly, the KLA Political Directorate did not set KLA policy, and it did not exercise political control over the KLA. Slide 78, please. The SPO at paragraph 18 of its pretrial brief argues that there was a KLA, quote, policy concerning opponents, and then alleges that it was the KLA Political Directorate which quote, had responsibility for KLA policy. Slide 79. The SPO in its pretrial brief then implies that an alleged KLA policy to target so-called opponents was created through the General Staff's, quote, policy-making authority, which was allegedly respected by KLA members and which allegedly found itself in KLA rules and regulations as well as in KLA public statements. And yesterday, you were told, and I quote, in his role at the Political Directorate, KLA policy was Thaci's responsibility. Slide 80. The implication is therefore that the alleged policy to target so-called opponents was created by the General Staff, and more specifically, the Political Directorate of the General Staff, and even more specifically, Hashim Thaci. But what evidence has the SPO cited to support its contention that the Political Directorate and Mr. Thaci, quote, had responsibility for KLA policy? All we have is the prosecution pretrial brief. And there it cites to only one piece of evidence, a book written by Mr. Jakub Krasniqi. Slide 81, please. Before we turn to Mr. Krasniqi's book, it is important for the trial panel to understand that the Albanian language makes no distinction between the words policy and politics. In Albanian, both concepts are covered by the same word, politik. But the words have very different consequential meanings in English. In English, politics is defined as exercising or seeking power in the governmental or public affairs of a state, municipality, etc. And in English, policy is defined as a course of action adopted and pursued by a government, ruler, political party, etc. The Political Directorate of the KLA, including Hashim Thaci, publicly presented the KLA's politics. In other words, the KLA's political positions. That's why it was called the Political Directorate and not the Policy Directorate. The Political Directorate's task was to meet and negotiate with international leaders and representatives to secure their support for the cause of Kosovo's freedom. neither Hashim Thaci nor the political directorate were responsible for setting KLA, quote, policy. Slide 82. Now returning to Mr. Krasniqi's 2006 book titled The Major Turning Point, which is the sole piece of evidence cited by the SPO in its pretrial brief to support its allegation that the political directorate was responsible for setting KLA policy. Mr. Krasniqi's book was written in Albanian. The SPO submitted an English translation of a short excerpt of that book to support its allegation that the political directorate set KLA policy. That excerpt is the following quotation. Hashim Thaci from Buroj, Skenderaj, had pursued his PhD studies in political sciences in Zurich University. He was among the first KLA political leaders and the leader of the student movement in the 1990s, was the head of the political department leading KLA policy. Although sentenced in absentia by the enemy's court, he was continuously present in Kosovo. Slide 83, please. Now, putting aside Mr. Krasniqi's incorrect assertion that Mr. Thaci was continuously present in Kosovo, the key question is whether Mr. Krasniqi actually asserted that Mr. Thaci was the head of the political department and was, quote, leading KLA policy. In the original Albanian text, Mr. Krasniqi wrote that Mr. Thaci directed the politik. The correct translation of politik in this context should have been that Mr. Thaci directed the KLA's politics and not its, quote, policy. But the SPO submitted an incorrect translation to the pretrial judge, who confirmed the indictment on the basis of the inaccurate translation that Mr. Thaci was allegedly responsible for KLA policy. It should not be in dispute any longer that the word politik in Mr. Krasniqi's book should be understood in English to mean that he asserts that Mr. Thaci directed the KLA's politics and not its policy. We know this because in July of 2021, the SPO provided an updated translation of Mr. Krasniqi's book, which now has the correct translation. Quote, Hashim Thaci from Buroj, Skenderaj municipality, who had pursued postgraduate studies in political sciences at Zurich University, one of the first political leaders of the KLA, and the leader of the student movement in the 1990s, headed the political directorate. He directed all the politics of the KLA. Next slide, 84. Again, this is the SPO's own updated translation. Accordingly, there should no longer be any dispute that the SPO incorrectly translated the evidence used to confirm the indictment and in its pretrial brief to allege that the political directorate was in charge of KLA policy, and therefore its allegation that the political directorate was responsible for an alleged policy of targeting civilians. The political directorate and Hashim Thaci were not in charge of the KLA's policies, but rather were tasked with presenting the political positions of the KLA. It should be noted that the SPO provided the correct translation of Mr. Krasniqi's book in July of 2021. Nevertheless, 5 months later, in its pretrial brief of December of 2021, it cited to the earlier incorrect translation to continue to assert that the political directorate was responsible for KLA policy. It then repeated this false allegation against Mr. Thaci yesterday, and the only evidence we know of is what they cited to support the earlier mistranslation. Why the SPO continues to rely on the mistranslation remains unexplained. Slide 85, please. Next, we turn to Hashim Thaci's role in the so-called Provisional Government of Kosovo. Slide 86. Hashim Thaci never had any executive legal authority in his capacity as so-called Prime Minister of the Provisional Government of Kosovo because, as Mr. Kehoe explained, the Provisional Government of Kosovo never came into existence as had been contemplated at Rambouillet, and instead was superseded by UNMIK. Mr. Thaci never had authority over the KLA in his capacity as the so-called Prime Minister of the Provisional Government of Kosovo. While it is true that Mr. Thaci used titles such as Prime Minister in order to present himself to internationals as having more authority than he actually had, he used these titles in name only. As I will explain in a moment, the evidence, or absence of evidence, sufficiently demonstrates this fact. He did as much as he could to promote himself as a person of power and authority, but the reality was that he had no real authority and never had effective control. Soon after the arrival of UNMIK, Mr. Thaci realized that UNMIK had the real power and authority to govern Kosovo and began to cooperate with UNMIK. Slide 87, please. As an aspiring politician with hopes of leading Kosovo, it was in Mr. Thaci's interest to demonstrate to UNMIK that he was a reliable and credible partner. He had no motive to allow or encourage the commission of crimes in Kosovo. Such chaos would only undermine his relevance to international leaders and the local population. To the contrary, he continued to need international support, particularly the support of the United States. Not for personal aspirations, but more importantly, because Kosovo's status had yet to be determined, including Kosovo's ultimate goal of independence. Fomenting violence and lawlessness in the direct presence of UNMIK, international organizations and NGOs, and the world media would have been fatal to Kosovo's independence objectives, and the SPO's allegations to the contrary simply make no sense. Slide 88, please. Hashim Thaci never had authority to investigate and prosecute crimes committed in Kosovo. Such power and responsibility rested with UNMIK. While Mr. Thaci was an influential person and pretended to have power, he had no effective control of the KLA or former KLA persons or people wearing KLA uniforms. The SPO makes much of Mr. Thaci's use of the title of Prime Minister, but what does the evidence actually show in terms of whether a superior-subordinate relationship existed between Mr. Thaci and any KLA perpetrators committing crimes? The prosecution has not cited any credible evidence that Hashim Thaci issued any orders to KLA units or soldiers, whether in his capacity as the so-called Prime Minister of the Provisional Government of Kosovo or as a member of the General Staff or otherwise. And the prosecution has cited no evidence of any reporting line between Mr. Thaci and KLA units or perpetrators. If there are no orders from Mr. Thaci to KLA units and no reporting from KLA units to Mr. Thaci, it is unclear how the SPO thinks it can prove that a superior subordinate relationship existed between Mr. Thaci and KLA perpetrators of crimes. Moreover, it is clear that Mr. Thaci had no material ability to prevent or punish crimes. Slide 89, please. As I mentioned previously, NGOs were on the ground in Kosovo post-conflict and documented the crimes committed in the lawlessness of the immediate post-war period. One such NGO was the International Crisis Group. In its report of the November 2nd, 1999, titled Who's Killing Whom in Kosovo, ICG agreed that there were many people running around Kosovo wearing KLA uniforms, but who were not necessarily part of the KLA. Quote, KLA uniforms and insignia are widely available at shops and kiosks throughout Kosovo and Albania, and after all, anyone can wear a mask. Slide 90. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reached a similar conclusion in his report of the 27th of November, 1999, concerning the prevalence of KLA uniforms in Kosovo. Quote, some victims of ethnic violence have reported that their assailants, including men in KLA uniforms, although it is possible that much of the violence is simply the work of criminal elements masquerading in uniforms of the KLA. Open borders have in fact allowed the large-scale arrival of criminal elements, particularly from Albania. It has also been noted that the KLA uniforms are available for about 50 Deutschmarks in Albania, and that Albanian national men with no relationship at all to the KLA can use the uniform as a passport through the German KFOR sector of Kosovo. Slide 91. And to my earlier point about how post-war violence was not in the interest of Kosovo's independence ambitions, and therefore not in Mr. Thaci's interests, we note this corroborating quote from the ICG's November report. It is also generally acknowledged that it is not in the interests of the KLA leadership to be seen sanctioning the increasingly barbaric attacks on Serbs. They are aware of the damaging effect of such assaults, often upon elderly and defenseless civilians, that are rapidly eroding the hard-won sympathy that the Kosovo Albanians enjoy in the West. Slide 92. The ICG report then notes, it is likely credible that Mr. Thaci specifically was unhappy with the crimes being committed. Quote, it is credible that the KLA leader Hashim Thaci, together with many of the KLA's higher command, could be unhappy with the continued assaults and intimidation inflicted on Kosovo's non-Albanian population. KLA leaders have consistently called for Serbs to remain in Kosovo. Thaci said that he was committed to establishing a society of tolerance and that he regretted acts of violence against Serbs and the flight of Serb civilians, saying that, quote, we were committed from the very first day to establishing a society where tolerance and not revenge would rule. We ask all Serbs who left Kosovo to return to help peace and democracy and to respect each other. Since the KLA never had a unified central command, its leadership, even if sincere, can therefore not give complete assurances that KLA soldiers are not responsible for specific acts of violence. Thaci also does not speak for all KLA and former KLA commanders or soldiers, many of whom are known to be vehemently opposed to demilitarization. Slide 93. This is the first video we'll play, and what we'll show you now is in real time the statements Mr. Thaci made in the summer of 1999 concerning the violence. Mr. Thaci repeatedly and publicly called for an end to violence and for the maintenance of Kosovo as a multi-ethnic country where the rights and safety of all citizens would be respected. The following is a video of a public statement issued by Mr. Thaci on the 17th of June, 1999.
I call on Serbs to come back to Kosovo, to those Serbs who fled Kosovo, because we consider that these massacres were not committed by the Serbian people. Because we consider that these people can offer a vital contribution for the future and prosperity of Kosovo. And we have worked. We have not waged a war to cleanse Kosovo, but a war so that we are all free and equal.
Slide 94. And 9 days later, on the 26th of June, 1999, Mr. Thaci went to Mitrovica to speak to a large crowd and to diffuse potential ethnic violence.
I am glad we are meeting in Mitrovica today, for which we fought. We have come here today with Mr. De Mello to talk to you and also to talk to the Serb side across the bridge. We crossed the bridge, we went to the hospital, we have sent our people there, they started work, and we are interested in regulating and fixing everything in close cooperation with the international community, and we are going to fix it. As always, we are really interested in solving every problem in a dignified way, with discipline, with culture. We have even waged our war in a cultural way, and so we are going back to premises and build lives with real civic culture, not only Albanian culture, but a democratic culture. We need to understand that Serbs too need to live in Mitrovica, those who have not committed crimes, those who have not killed people. We are not interested, and we do not fuel the fires of a mono-ethnic life. We need to understand that whoever wants to live in Kosovo should live in Kosovo. Kosovo belongs to Kosovars, and they are going to live here.
Go to slide 95, please. A few days later, on the 2nd of July, 1999, Mr. Thaci called for tolerance and ethnic inclusion in a joint statement with other leaders. The first speaker in the video is Mr. Sergio De Mello, the then Special Representative of the Secretary General.
Today, I believe, is the first time that Albanian and Serb leaders of Kosovo meet and talk to one another, establish a dialogue on the most pressing issue of the moment, which is the safety, security, the right to life, the right to property of all inhabitants of this province.
We will stand. We will stand. Could you just sit, please? Well done. I miss it.
We call on all citizens of Kosovo, be them civilians or military, to refrain and influence the others to refrain from undertaking acts of violence against their neighbors, since such acts are unacceptable and those who are responsible for such acts will be brought to justice. We also insist that all the missing people are handed over to UNMIK representatives. We support the joint efforts currently made by activists of Albanian or Serb or other communities, so that, together with UNMIK and other international organizations, to implement these requests. The road to reconciliation will be long and difficult. It is not true that there is an innate hatred amongst people in Kosovo. We need to work together. As first steps, we have agreed today to immediately establish a line of communication between us, ANMIC and KFOR, and holding of joint meetings like this one today. Send out joint messages of reconciliation from TVs and radios. Create a joint crisis force in the region together with ANMIC and KFOR, which would be able to address urgent problems anywhere, including historic and religious sites, and organize an early meeting between religious and spiritual leaders calling for tolerance.
Miloševićevog režima na Kosovu. Osobe osumnjičene za ratne zločine i zločine protiv čovječnosti će biti izvedene pred lice pravde. Mi podržavamo ulogu.
Both sides condemned the crimes of the Milosevic regime. Persons suspected of war crimes and crimes against humanity shall be brought to justice. We support the role of the International War Crimes Tribunal. Peace can only be built on justice, not revenge.
Sure.
You can go to slide 96, please. And 3 days later, on the 6th of July, 1999, Mr. Thaci publicly condemned crimes, including against the Serb population. This is at least the fourth such public statement by Mr. Thaci in the first few weeks after the armed conflict ended.
It is true that recently, especially following the end of the war, and the last few days in particular, we have seen a not very good, decent, or responsible situation by certain individuals or groups who have been involved in breaking into apartments, also abusing the symbols of Kosovo Liberation Army, in lootings, burglaries, burnings, destructions, also in desecrating monuments and busts of Serbs. This is a concerning and worrying phenomenon for us. The Kosovo Provisional Government and myself personally distance ourselves from such irresponsible acts.
If we can go to slide 97. Mr. Thaci's public calls for ethnic tolerance and unity continued throughout the summer and fall of 1999. And we see that in the following video of Mr. Thaci in Rahovec on the 17th of July, 1999.
Your town, as it always known, will also know today to separate the good from the bad, to separate what is even incomprehensible, not respectable at all, or what we have experienced for our orientation, our future. However, the time has come today, as we have always respected new realities created, not to think too much of revenge, of hatred, of divisions. Today is a time of unification, and for this unification, each of us has to play their role, from ordinary citizens to politicians and all the public strata, without any discrimination, political affiliation, ideology, province, religion, or any other affiliation. We should be the ones who, unlike never before, unite for the independence of Kosovo. We do not need an ethnic town. We need to respect all those who want to live in town as free citizens, as law-abiding citizens, citizens who do not think about confrontations, and citizens who did not participate in the massacres committed against our brothers, sisters, and parents. We'll respect all those worthy of respect, but we will also not allow anyone to shield criminals in the town of Rahovec. also not going to allow anarchy in town. No anarchy and no spirit of intolerance whatsoever in Kosovo. Because, as we have often shown ourselves, we will show ourselves again that we are the ones who have always respected and who will keep respecting the rules of democratic order. As we respected that in the past, we're going to respect it again in the future.
Next slide, slide 98. On the 21st of July, 1999, the day before the killings of 14 Serbs in the Staro Gracko in Kosovo, Mr. Thaci visited Serb victims of crimes together with a Serbian Orthodox priest, Father Sava, as well as with Mr. Bernard Kushner, the special representative of the Secretary General, and Mr. Momcilo Trajkovic, a Kosovo Serb politician. Next slide, 99. After the killings in Staro Gracko occurred, which Mr. Thaci immediately described to the BBC as, quote, a crazy act designed to wreck the improving